All right, and we're going live. Thank you everyone for making it. My name is Santosh. I'm a community organizer with Food and Water Watch, as well as with the Stop Holtec Coalition, which was created this year. And that was response to Holtec's plans to dump radioactive waste into the Hudson River. Since this summer, we've since got a law in the books from Governor Hochul that says that is illegal. So now we have this radioactive waste at Indian Point, specifically radioactive wastewater. We want to make sure, I think everyone on this call that's here, that wastewater is kept out of our air and our water. So today we'll be talking about how we think we can achieve that, and we'll be highlighting one independent expert. So Arnie Gunderson, we're very lucky to have him here, and very lucky that he could spend his day with us. Going to ask that, some people are still trickling in, that you introduce yourself in the chat, give your name, group you're with, or where you're from. If you're with the media outlet, identify that as well. And then what you want to get out of this webinar, so that we can see who's in the room. We have a wide range. So we have activists, we have new people, we have elected officials, staffers. So we want to be able to accommodate everyone. It's good to see who's here by putting that in the chat. Next slide. I want to thank all our co-sponsors. So there's a lot of advocacy organizations here. These are all pieces of the Stop Holtec Coalition as well, which was integral to making sure that we got the Save the Hudson bill passed. I want to give a shout out to both Senator Harcum and Assemblymember Levenberg. I know the Assembly members here and some staff from Harcum is as well. Thank you both for your advocacy and sponsoring that bill. A lot of the grassroots groups and advocacy organizations now want to make sure that waste does not end up in our air or water. Want to also thank Assemblymember Chris Ekus for taking time for being here. There's a lot of different staffers from a lot of different people. I'm not going to be able to name you all, but definitely mention you're here in the chat so that we know. And then, when we're doing our follow-up, where you guys are at. Want to also, what's happening in Indian Point is an example of a problem everywhere. Nuclear waste is something we're going to have to tackle in a lot of different sites. Want to give a shout out in solidarity to other groups and other areas that are dealing with their own reactor sites. So that's Pilgrim in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, San Onofre in Southern California, Oyster Creek, Vermont Yankee, Diablo Canyon in Central California, and the Palisades plant in Michigan. Thank you all. If you're coming from those fights to see what's going on, get an update on Holtec, get an update on how we're doing it. Glad you can join us and hope you can take away something that you can bring back to your campaigns. And I see that the former Congress member, Mondaire Jones, is here. Thank you again for joining us. Might even be staff from the current Congress member's staff on here too. Next slide. So agenda is pretty basic here. You guys can read it. I'm not gonna read it right off for you, but just a few things on what this event is. We want this event to be kind of a quick briefing on where things stand with the radioactive waste at Indian Point, and kind of break down some of the alternatives and really why we want on-site storage, and why we need that to keep this from getting in this waste from getting into our air and water. So to that end, there'll be a little bit more of a dive into what on-site storage could look like. And that'll be featured through Arnie Gunderson, our independent engineer. And then, the way we win this stuff and the way we were able to see our advocacy come into fruition is through people power. So we want to give activists, everyday people, some next steps to then take this and ensure that this waste does not end up in our air and water. The agenda here kind of reflects that. We want to make sure that's what we are doing going forward. Next slide. And I'll pass it on.
Hi, I'm Tina Volz-Bongar, and I'm with United for Clean Energy and the Stop Holtec from Dumping in the Hudson Coalition. That's what I like to say. I don't want to stop Holtec. from doing the best decommissioning that we can do, and that is keeping all radioactivity out of our air and water. So we think that that's a fair ask, especially those like me who live within the 10-mile radius of the plant. So closing of the point was in 2017. Cuomo announced that they closed Unit 2 and Unit 3 in 2020, in 2020 and 2021. And Holtec, a month after they closed, was able to make a deal with everybody and obtain the 2.7. Somebody's calling me for a link. Sorry about that. Anyway, Holtec was able to get the $2.4 billion trust fund funded by the ratepayers of New York. So thank you, ratepayers, for that. The Decommissioning Oversight Board, we were lucky to have that created by former Assembly Member Sandy Galiff, State Senator Harcum. A lot of influence were these forums that we did with other experts and people who had decommissioning power plants in their communities. So anyway, next slide. So the regulatory landscape is that we really do refer to the NRC as the Nuclear Rubber Stamping Commission. And that is unfortunate, but that is because it's really primarily driven by industry. So state agencies do have some power here to deal with Holtec, and we're working with them as much as we can to do something about that. So the community learned that Holtec is currently going to postpone decommissioning for 8 years. And they apparently sent a letter to the NRC on November 4th and announced that they would be postponing it. In April, they also announced that they would be postponing decommissioning at Oyster Creek, and that was because for inflation reasons around that. So anyway, they cited the bill that was passed here in New York State, and they also cited something at Pilgrim. They had a state permit to stop the dumping there. So at the decommission, we're looking forward to the next decommissioning board meeting on December 6th. We hope people will come to find out exactly what is, what are Holtec's plans. So next slide.
Hi, everybody. I'm Iris Hiskey-Arno, and I live in Hastings-on-Hudson, and I co-chair the Environment Committee of NYCD 16 Indivisible. As you've heard, the NRC is not going to put our interests above those of big polluters or stand up for our kids and our river. So I'm here today to talk about the importance of people power, because as Santosh said, it's everyday New Yorkers like you and me who ultimately won the Save the Hudson bill, and we are the ones who will make sure that the radioactive waste from the decommissioning of Indian Point doesn't wind up in our air and our water and therefore in our bodies. So just quickly, back in January and February, local leaders and some organizations like Grassroots Environmental Education and Clearwater organized some webinars to get the word out about the new danger at the Indian Point power plant, that Holtec, the company in charge of decommissioning it, was going to dump 1 million tons of radioactive wastewater into the Hudson. And soon after that, the Stop Holtec Coalition that you've been hearing about was created, and it quickly grew to include over 100 groups. So we began mobilizing. We held forums and rallies to raise public awareness. We circulated petitions, sent texts, phone banks. We spoke at public hearings. We went to decommissioning oversight board meetings. We called and lobbied our municipal and county boards, our state legislators, and the governor, and we traveled to Albany over and over again. We would not be stopped. And the momentum kept growing. Nearly 500,000 people signed on to a citizen petition, and 35 municipal and county resolutions were passed in opposition to the dumping. Then up in Albany, State Senator Pete Harcum and Assembly Member Dana Levenberg introduced the Save the Hudson bill, which would make it illegal to dump radioactive waste from a decommissioning nuclear power plant into the Hudson due to the negative economic impact on the region. So we were really psyched when the Senate and the Assembly passed the bill, but the fight wasn't over because we still needed the governor to sign it into law. And then came the key decision moment when Holtec announced it was going to dump the wastewater into the river in mid-September. We had a tight deadline, we increased the pressure on the governor, and finally she signed the bill into law in the nick of time. So we won the Save the Hudson bill because we focused on the key decision maker, Governor Hochul. Now we have to use our same formula of applying public pressure, working with elected officials, and watching for that key decision moment in order to get our outcome, which is keeping radioactive waste out of our air and water. Next slide. So why do we have to do this now? Well, it's because nuclear energy has a waste problem. You'll hear more about this from our experts, but basically the radioactive water at Indian Point contains tritium, which has been linked to high cancer rates when it's ingested or absorbed to the skin. And there are other radioactive substances in the water which haven't been tested for. And although they aren't the focus of our talk today, you've probably all heard about the radioactive spent fuel rods up at Indian Point as well. So what are the alternatives? Well, the waste could be transported somewhere else, but nobody wants our radioactive waste, of course. And this would, as usual, create environmental justice issues, since we all know that should the waste be trucked away, it would be taken to a frontline or disadvantaged community. It has been suggested that the waste could be evaporated, but that would pollute our air. It could be burned, but that would also create harmful air emissions. So we're left with storing it on site. And that is the topic of today's meeting and the solution that we believe is the safest current alternative. Thanks. Next slide.
All right. Thank you, everybody. My name's Courtney Williams, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion with our expert, Arnie Gunderson. And so just to start out with a little intro, and I'm just going to read it because it is a long and impressive bio from Mr. Gunderson. Arnie Gunderson is chief engineer at Fair Winds Associates. He's a nuclear engineer and a former nuclear industry executive with more than 51 years of nuclear industry experience in engineering, operations, and safety analysis. Mr. Gunderson and his wife Maggie are another Fair Winds founder, became nuclear whistleblowers in 1990. Fair Winds has written dozens of expert reports for legal cases and non-governmental and nonprofit organizations worldwide. Mr. Gunderson is also a co-author of 3 major international peer-reviewed scientific papers documenting the contamination of environments by migrating radioactive particles of dust and dirt. So thank you all for joining us, and especially thank you to Arnie Gunderson for coming on to share his expertise. We've gotten a very myopic view from the experts that the Decommissioning Oversight Board has chosen to speak with. And so we very much felt this was an important forum to have so people could hear a different opinion other than Holtec is right 100% of the time. So with Arnie, thank you so much for coming on. And just to jump right in, you know, we've heard from the DOB, we've heard from their chosen expert that the best way to handle this tritiated wastewater is to dump it into the Hudson River. And you have a differing view. And I think a lot of us, you know, I'm a scientist. I have used tritium and other radionuclides in the lab, and I know the lengths that I need to go to properly dispose of these things, and dumping them down the drain is not one of those options. So what, in your expert opinion, is the safest, best solution for this waste, since it's already here, it's not going anywhere?
Well, yeah, thanks everybody for having me, and happy Thanksgiving week to everybody. What to do with the waste is not unique to Indian Point, but what is special about Indian Point is that the river's already contaminated with PCBs. There's this scientific term called synergistic toxicity. It's a great word. And what it means is that PCBs are bad and tritium is bad, but the combination is worse than the sum of the two, so that the toxicity of one amplifies the toxicity of the other. So I'm really encouraged that Governor Hochul decided to stop the release of tritiated water, but it's more than that. There's other radioactive isotopes in it too. But the radioactive water from Indian Point into the Hudson, because of this thing called synergistic toxicity, it can be stored on site. Now, I realize Holtec will say no. I was senior vice president of an engineering organization, and we did some pretty amazing things that other people thought couldn't be done. 2-story high over/under fuel pools. The patent I have teaches against the art of turbine missile shields, and on and on. So I'm not afraid when other people say, oh, it can't be done. In fact, not only can it be done, but it has been done. At Vermont Yankee, they were storing tritium, tritiated water, in the basement of the turbine building. They didn't get the town's permission. They didn't get the NRC's permission. The building already existed. And because of that, they didn't need anybody's permission to store radioactive tritium in the basement of the turbine hall. Now, I've been following very closely reactor decommissioning at the Zion plant in Michigan. And you can actually go up, and there's a pretty comprehensive slides of the decommissioning at Zion. And they dismantled the turbine hall, sold it for scrap, and I actually spoke to the president of Zion Solutions about this, and they actually made money by stripping out all of the metal that's inside of the turbine hall and selling it for scrap. It's not radioactive. The turbine hall is not radioactive. The large vertical building on site with the dome on the top, that's highly radioactive. That's containment. The long horizontal building is the turbine hall. So it's actually a moneymaker for Holtec to strip the metal out of that turbine hall and keep the building intact. That's exactly what they did at Zion. So my proposal is that they should build 4 or 5 tanks in the gutted basement of the turbine hall and use that to store tritiated water. Now, this is a huge building. It's probably as big as 12 indoor tennis courts. And when it's gutted, it's impressive. It's like a dirigible hangar. And so that process of gutting it makes money for Holtec, leaving a facility that then you could put tankage in to store the radioactive waste until this issue of synergistic toxicity is resolved.
Sorry, we've been told that isn't possible. It's certain these things would leak, and that then, it would be evaporating into the air. So what does your solution account for those concerns?
Well, first off, these tanks are at atmospheric pressure. They're not pressurized and prone to cracking and leaking. The second thing is that to eliminate evaporation in a tank, it's sitting at roughly 70 degrees because the base mat of that building is quite cool. And so evaporation's minimal anyway, but all tanks have a vent on the top. So that as the volume changes, air can move in or out. So the tank doesn't expand or contract. Now, what I'm proposing is, it's real simple. It's done all the time, is to put essentially a rubber balloon on the vent. so that as the tank expands, the balloon grows larger, and as it contracts, the balloon contracts. That prevents any evaporation of radioactive tritiated water. Now, if you're really worried about that, the concept of tritium going airborne, the worst thing you want to do is dump it in the Hudson, because the Hudson is tidal, which means that there's exposed, the edges of the river are exposed at low tide, so that what the tritium that's at the edges of the river is going to go airborne anyway. So the people that are saying, "Oh, watch out, it's going to go airborne," their proposal is actually worse than storing it in tanks. The concept that I've chosen has been done before. I said it, Vermont Yankee, did not require state approval, did not require town approval, and did not require NRC approval because it was in an existing building. If the tank were to leak, it's not going to fail catastrophically. It might weep, and you build another tank so that when the tank is noticed to be weeping, you pump it into another tank and solve the problem. It's simply not it's not a problem I worry about.
And so I know the Union of Concerned Scientists put out several years ago now, a study where they looked at the effects of sea level rise on nuclear plants. And they did identify Indian Point as a plant that would be inundated. I think their estimate was twice a month sometime in the next few decades, because of that increase in sea level rise. So do we have to worry about that in this regard with the storage of the water for, because we don't know how long it will be there?
Well, if you're worried about sea level rise, there are more than a dozen power plants on the Atlantic, from Seabrook to in New Hampshire down to Connecticut, the Millstone units, down into New Jersey, into Maryland, and down into North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida. There's dozens of power plants that would be subject to the similar phenomena, and they're perhaps 100 million times more radioactive than the radioactivity at that remains in the water at Indian Point. So, I view that as a straw man argument. There, if that's really a concern, then you have to shut down every nuke on the East Coast, because sea level rise will be at least 100 million times worse were a tidal surge to hit Seabrook or Millstone or the Salem units. In addition, though, if let's suppose that the Hudson flooded, that a tank becomes surrounded by water for a couple hours is not the end of the world. I mean, these tanks are robust and they could be surrounded by water, but I really don't grant that as a high probability situation. And the consequences are so much worse for any other power plant that's operating on the East Coast. So I think it's a straw man argument.
In a previous discussion, you had mentioned the possibility of berms. Could that be used to protect the turbine building?
Within you could build the tanks into a concrete berm around the tanks. So yeah, you could build a berm high enough to prevent river rise from affecting the tanks. But again, if we're worried about the Hudson flooding that high, the problem in Connecticut or New Jersey or Florida or on is 100 million times worse. So I would urge everybody, if that's the issue that you want to hang your hat on, you got to shut down every nuclear plant on the East Coast, because it's 100 million times worse.
Thank you. So based on your experience, and I think you've alluded to this in your previous answers, we spoke about tritiated water, but you mentioned that that's not necessarily all that is in this wastewater. So what should be the very first step with regards to the water before we decide, before a plan is made to store it? What else do we need to do?
Well, right now, it seems like Holtec is assuming that the water is homogeneous. And I don't believe that's true. I think they really need a thorough independent analysis of what's in those tanks. Just don't take a sample in the middle of the tank and assume that that matches the bottom of the tank or the corners of the tank. I would expect that there'd be a lot of contamination as a dust, which would become mobile as the tanks, as the pools are being drained, that are not being accounted for in Holtec's single homogeneous sample. So I think you need an independent group to get in there and perhaps 10 samples in each of the fuel pools and 10 samples in each of the tanks, top, bottom, sides, middle. We give you a better idea of what the contamination is in those tanks. And then Holtec is proposing to release it and then do the calculations after it's released, which makes no sense to me either. It would be much better if you had an idea of what was in those tanks and controlled the release as it was occurring, as opposed to after the horse is out of the barn.
Thank you. And so right now they've told us that New York State is testing this, but of course not until after it's been dumped. But should they use New York State testing, or you're suggesting a different laboratory do this work?
There are independent labs that I think can do this work better than the state of New York. And it's not that the state of New York is a poor lab, but there are independent labs that do this daily with a lot of, the frequency which they're testing radionuclides is a lot more frequent than the New York State lab. And so the people working on the process and the procedures that they use are tested and they are benchmarked against many samples. And so, I use, Maggie and I and our co-author, Dr. Kaltofen, use a lab, but there are several labs out there which are incredibly competent and do it with a frequency that allows me to really trust the result.
Thank you. So do you think that these are parts that there's this memorandum of understanding that New York State has with Holtec? Are these things that we should be pushing to get them into that memorandum to improve that? This idea of independent testing?
I read the memorandum of understanding and I was not impressed. I think an independent lab and if there is a release, that those releases be monitored and contained before releasing, as opposed to once the horse is out of the barn. It's weak tea, and I think you could have a much better memorandum of understanding.
So another question, and I think this is, I've heard from people as I talk about this, that there's no evidence that tritium is dangerous. There's no, study that shows this. And I feel like folks aren't really understanding that a lot of that information isn't out there because nobody has bothered to look. So last year, the National Academies of Sciences They put out a study looking at low-level radiation, and basically the conclusion was we don't know enough to say that it's safe and it needs to be studied. But what data is there? What evidence is there already that show that the concerns that these communities have and our elected officials share and the health experts we've spoken with share? What evidence is there that we need to be paying attention to, or that we can use in our advocacy, given that the NRC hasn't studied this in decades, that we can use to point to the need for public health to be paramount?
Well, I think, I rely on public health experts to make that expertise. I'm an engineer, but you have Dr. Gordon Edwards up in Canada who's written extensively about it. Dr. Ian Fairley in the UK has written extensively about the fact that we really don't know enough about tritium. And then here in the States, Dr. Tim Mousseau, who's in South Carolina with Maggie and I, has done a peer-reviewed literature search, and his conclusion was there's not enough information to make a conclusion that tritium is harmless. Then you got Dr. Arjun Markajani, and Arjun has written a book about the lack of good science on tritium. And it's not just tritium. There's other stuff in that water with longer half-lives than tritium, but then there's that synergistic toxicity with what's already in the Hudson River, which is the PCBs from General Electric. And that I did a study of, and I couldn't find any linkage where anyone has studied synergistic toxicity between tritiated water and PCBs. So it's not just tritium. The Hudson River compounds the problem.
Nope. There's a piece of paper covering your camera there briefly. This brings me to another question, or maybe back to your what you mentioned earlier about synergistic toxicities. So I am a cancer researcher by trade, and I live here. I can look out my window right now. I can see the trash incinerator that's burning Westchester County's garbage and polluting my air. I can look out the other window. I can see the reactor domes of Indian Point. Sometimes I see the plume of smoke from the gypsum plant. I can walk one block and be at the paint factory. I go for a walk along the riverfront and see neighbors that are fishing to eat the shellfish and the aquatic fish that they get out of the river. And try as I might, I cannot find, there's lots of individual pieces of data about the health effects of air pollution, about the health effects of lead, cadmium, mercury, PCBs. There's not a lot on tritium, but really, am I wrong in concluding that there's kind of zero evidence out there that we could look to and say, in the context of this gamish of all of these different exposures that my community is facing, that tritium is not, additional tritium from Indian Point being dumped is not going to make matters worse for my community and other river towns up and down the Hudson?
Yeah, I think it is likely, given the research on synergistic toxicity, that tritium in and of itself, it's radioactive. So there's going to be that impact, but there's the synergistic effect of it interacting with everything else. Let me touch on one thing. The tritium is naturally occurring in incredibly small quantities. It's created by cosmic rays bombarding the upper layers of the atmosphere and comes down as rain. But the tritium in that pool is 70,000 times more radioactive than the naturally occurring water that's in the Hudson. So what Holtec is proposing to do is to take the Hudson River and rename it. They're going to take 80,000 gallons out of the Hudson River, and they're going to call it the circulating water system. And then they're going to pump 100 gallons of this highly radioactive tritiated water into it and pump it back into the Hudson River. So they're going to dilute this 70,000 times more radioactive water in the spent fuel pool with 70,000 gallons of Hudson River, but they're renaming it as circulating water system, and then allowing that circulating water system to go back in the Hudson. And in the process, they claim that they haven't affected the Hudson River. In fact, they've renamed the Hudson River as a circulating water system. And the net effect is the river is being contaminated at much higher levels than is allowable. But at the point it's redischarged back into the Hudson, that's where the NRC is measuring the tritium level.
Thank you for that, Arnie. At the last DOB Decommissioning Oversight Board meeting, there were some entrepreneurs from a company that proposed a pyrolysis solution. So for those who don't know, pyrolysis is like a new word that the industry has come up with that just really means a type of burning, like incinerating, just like you would burn garbage, but now they want to call it advanced recycling and other things, and they've dubbed it pyrolysis. So is this I mean, I'm fighting the trash incinerator outside my window, so I don't think incineration is a solution to any waste problem. But can you talk a little bit about the possibilities for pyrolysis as a solution to our nuclear waste problem here at Indian Point?
Well, heating water to boil it off doesn't make the tritium go away. It makes the tritium change phase from a liquid to a gas. And so they're pumping it, instead of pumping it into the river, they're pumping it into the air. And related to that is that the tritium is heavier than water. So when you boil water, you increase the remaining tritium because it doesn't boil off as fast. So the water that's left actually has a higher concentration of tritium than the water which is being boiled off. Yeah, the net effect is that you're concentrating the tritium in the spent fuel pool and boiling off water and not volatilizing the tritium.
Okay, thank you. To move, I guess it's still related to water, but we know that for many, many years, radioactive water has been leaking from the system of pipes at Indian Point. So, and not just with tritium, but with the really nasty stuff that has found its way into the Hudson River. And so that's just been leaking into the soil at the site for decades now. What is your recommendation to us about approaching this larger issue of site contamination, even aside from that tritiated water, but we just basically have an entire facility that has that's sitting on top of contaminated soil. I mean, and I know for myself, my kids are in the school district, their elementary school is like 4,000 feet from the reactor domes at Indian Point. And I and other parents have real concerns about having the kids at that elementary school while it's being demolished. The nuclear plant is being demolished.
Well, there's a couple issues there. The first is that Indian Point 1, which is an ancient plant, that's really our focus has been on the tritiated water in units 2 and 3. Indian Point 1 had a leaky fuel pool for at least a decade, if not more. And there's strontium in the radioactive strontium in the soil outside of the plant now, and it's slowly migrating into the river. The solution is to dig up the soil, collect it, and it would be to ship it to a licensed radioactive dump. But the other Unit 2 and Unit 3, the decommissioning of Unit 2 and Unit 3, the most radioactive thing on that site is the spent fuel. And that's taken out of the spent fuel pool and put into canisters, which are stored on site, because right now there's no place else to ship it. The industry had proposed Yucca Mountain, but right now there is no place to ship that waste. That's the most radioactive waste on the site. The second most radioactive waste on the site is the nuclear reactor vessel, the giant pressure cooker that held this nuclear fuel in place, and that's activated by the neutron bombardment over 40 plus years, and has lots of cobalt-60. Cobalt-60 has a 5-year half-life, and it gets cut. That will get cut up and shipped off-site as well to a licensed facility. There's nuclear reactor vessels stored right now in Washington State, for instance. Given it's got a 5-year half-life, in 50 or 60 years, it'll be much, 1,000 times less radioactive than it is today. The third most radioactive stuff is the pipes that are in, not the vertical building, not the turbine hall, that's clean, but the horizontal building. The vertical building is the contaminated one, rather. The horizontal building is clean. The vertical building has lots of radioactive pipe. Those get cut up, and in the process, it releases radioactivity as gas. Now, one would hope that the plan that Holtec has in place collects that gas through ultra high efficiency filters, but I would highly recommend monitors in the community for, they're called CAMs, continuous air monitors, that would pull the air into the filter, collect it as a dust on the filter, and then measure the dust. And then there's the liquids. They will be using more liquids to suppress dust, and they'll be creating radioactive liquids as this process goes along. The volume of which will probably be less than what's in that fuel pool, but it will add to the amount of liquid radioactive waste that would have to be stored.
Thank you. So I think we're approaching the end of our discussion and then moving on to some next steps and then the Q&A. But I'm just, as a final question, if we were going to give you the opportunity to get Governor Hochul and all the suits on the Decommissioning Oversight Board in a room with you, and you had 30 seconds to deliver the message that's gonna, change their minds or set them straight on what needs to be done here, what would you say to them?
I would say synergistic toxicity requires a better solution than what Holtec is proposing. And then I would say to the state that they shouldn't worry about a preemption argument. They shouldn't, Holtec's been threatening that if you don't do it our way, we'll say that the NRC's rules preempt the state, which isn't true in this case, again, because of the synergistic toxicity. So I would congratulate Governor Hochul and urge the state to hold the line until the waste further decays.
Thank you so much, Arnie. I hope you'll be able to stick around for the Q&A, because I know the chat's been very active with other questions. So with that, I'll kick it back to Santosh, I think, or whoever's doing next steps for action items.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Courtney and Arnie. There's a bunch there that I learned. I didn't now know how to pronounce paralysis, which is something I slipped up on. But you know, as you all could kind of tell here, right? The only viable alternative to this radioactive waste is to safely store it on site. And in order to achieve that, right, it comes back to people power. So with the Save the Hudson Mill, we had the public pressure plus the political advocacy from municipalities and elected officials and a decision moment, which gave us the outcome we need. That decision moment is still unclear right now. So we don't know really firmly what Holtec's plans are. We hope to get more information at this upcoming decommissioning oversight board meeting. But what we can do in the meantime is get ourselves ready for when we need to prepare for that decision moment. The easiest thing to do is what you're doing right here. So nearly 100 people showed up on the Zoom today. This people power is what gets our representatives and our agencies to pay attention. It's when there's a lot of activism, there are consequences of that activism. So the first thing here, really simple, is a petition. I'll share this with y'all. You all RSVP'd, but this is to Governor Hochul and the Public Service Commission, telling them to support on-site storage of this radioactive waste and urging us to really invest in solutions that matter. Sign that petition. But the thing we really need the most is if we had 80, 90 people at the decommissioning oversight board meeting on December 6th, that would be huge. So the same way we have a lot of folks here today, I don't want to say it's some magic number we need, but people showing up really does make a difference. And if we are able to communicate to agencies, representatives, as well as Governor Hochul, that they need to make sure this waste is contained and put on site, it will get heard. The next DOB meeting is December 6th at 6 p.m. We'll be getting there about an hour earlier at 5 p.m. We still haven't gotten full details on what that DOB meeting looks like, but generally there's some kind of public comment period. You can be in that space. There's a room where a lot of folks convene. I know some of the elected officials here are familiar with that space. For advocates, make sure your voice is heard that we need on-site storage. We may do something ahead of that meeting depending on what we learn is going to be happening at that meeting. But we have what, 7-8 minutes left. So thank you again for coming on here. The key to keeping this radioactive waste on site and out of our air and water is to show up. So come out December 6th, Portland Town Hall, 1 Heedy Street. Put it in your calendar now. That way you can't say, hey, you can't make it. Put in the chat if you can make it 5 p.m. to the decommissioning oversight board. For folks that don't see the petition, I will link it here in the chat. Just want to give me a minute. Oh, Judy's coming. Thank you. Let us know if you can make it. I put in the chat the link to the petition. That way, Hochul and the Public Service Commission register your comment. And want to go through, I know some questions came in the chat. I don't know if Courtney or Tina, you have a list of those questions and we can go through that.
Sure. Yeah, if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat for Arnie. So Tina had asked.
Sorry, a lot of people are saying they can come.
Okay, good. Do we know with the situation at Vermont Yankee where they were able to store the water in the building? Tina was asking if that creates a legal precedent for not needing those permits. And I think she's asking that because the Village of Buchanan has said they won't be issuing permits for any water storage?
Well, all I know is that the Vermont Yankee didn't ask permission from either the NRC, the town, or the state in order to store water in the turbine building. So I'm not a lawyer and I don't know about legal precedents, but again, I think that the town is being bullied by Holtec to force the town to do what Holtec wants. Holtec wants to knock this thing down quickly so it can get its hands on that $2.4 billion trust. The Zion plant, which is similar to the Indian Point plant, was a 2-unit plant, and it was dismantled for around $800 million. So the quicker Holtec does this, they wind up walking away with $1 billion free and clear when the process is done, based on experience at Zion, which is again awfully similar to Indian Point. So there's a boatload of money for Holtec to make, and the faster they can get the hands on it, the happier they'll be. But I think there's a lot of pressure on officials to comply with Holtec's view to get that facility removed as quickly as possible.
Another question, which is that we're constantly hearing from Holtec that this water that they're going to dump is no different than any other water that they've been dumping. Can you answer that question? Is that true? Is that accurate that this water is exactly the same what they've been dumping for decades?
I don't think it matters. I think when I look at the new analyses that's coming in on tritium from Gordon Edwards in Canada and Ian Fairley, Dr. Gordon Edwards, Dr. Ian Fairley, Dr. Arjun Makajani, and Dr. Tim Musso, I think we've learned over time, and it's time that we look at the totality of the new evidence before saying, well, just because we did it in the past, we should keep on doing it.
Yeah, I think they've been using our river as a radioactive sewer for long enough, and it's definitely time to stop that. We have another question about tangentially related. Oh wait, hold on. I'm getting other questions. Sorry. Oh, okay. What are the most important regulatory changes that we could make to protect ourselves and other communities? Because Indian Point is the first operating nuclear plant in New York to be shut down and decommissioned, and there are other communities that will follow in our wake. So what could we put in place now for Indian Point that would protect us and then protect other communities that are going to be going down the same path?
Well, the single most important thing you can do is to have the citizen advisory panel, and I realize the name in Indian Point is slightly different, but the panel that's empowered when the plant enters decommissioning, to have that panel have enough cash to hire independent experts. Every power plant I've worked at has a group of citizens who sit around and listen to the owner of the plant and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But they don't have cash to hire independent experts. And frankly, the NRC and Holtec are Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There's not one is going to agree with what the other one said. So the single biggest thing that the 9 Mile reactors in upstate New York or any reactor on this call could do would be to empower their citizen committee to be able to afford to bring in independent experts rather than rely on the owner or the NRC.
Thank you. And you know what, I think that is our experience now, which is that our DOB basically listens to what Holtec says, they accept it. They have an unpaid expert who just mostly agrees with that. And the whole point of our decommissioning oversight board was to have funds for this kind of independent expert. But frankly, they've refused to have any experts, or they make it as awful as possible with horrible technical snafus left and right, because they won't pay to bring anybody in person or even get their tech working properly. So it's been really an uphill battle to get the few experts that we've been able to get. Are there others? You know, some of the concerns we really have are the safety of the elementary school that's right there, the solutions to the waste that don't involve making another community an environmental justice community, because you know, we already are one ourselves and we don't really want to offload this problem. So what other experts, and you named some, Ian Fairley and Dr. Makajani earlier, but are there other experts that you'd recommend that we fight our DOB to bring in to share their expertise?
I should add, you know, Canada does this. Canada, the nation of Canada provides funds to the intervener groups to bring in experts to argue with Ontario and Ontario Power. I can't remember the exact name. So there is a precedent, but not in the United States. The other things that there are experts you could talk to. You know, Maggie and I work with Dr. Marco Kaltofen, who's world-renowned expert and has been working with the United States Senate on contaminated schools, both in Illinois near the Piketon facility and in St. Louis near an old dump that dates back to the 1940s. So there are, off the top of my head, I would definitely recommend Dr. Kaltofen, but there are many, many more who are capable of speaking to the group. You know, the other thing I would offer up is that make sure you get continuous air monitors throughout the community. And I'm not talking about just 4, you know, a network of perhaps 20 or 30 at different points of the compass would be reasonable during the dismantlement of this unit to make sure that the plume of radioactive gases does not wind up in the community. There's things that they can do while it's being dismantled to minimize the radiation exposure. And I would hold them to that as well. But, you know, it's very difficult when a dismantlement is occurring to get a public representative into the process. The NRC draws a line with preemption on that. And I don't know that that's a battle that you can fight. But you can certainly fight the battle of demanding monitoring throughout the surrounding communities with continuous air monitors as the facility is being dismantled.
Thank you, Arnie. Yeah, Holtec has already said now that all the fuel's in the spent fuel pools, they want to stop the monitoring for the air monitors. But thankfully, we did get, New York State has the NRC already pulled their resident inspector, but thankfully New York State was able to get their own inspector to be on site. So we at least have someone who is not paid by Holtec watching the shop. So with that, we're a little after 5 o'clock, and I do want to do a wrap up. So if folks have to go, that they can. And I think, Arnie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I had to sum it up, I think the word of the day is independent. We need independent experts not people like Holtec employees with a vested financial interest in doing this as cheap and as fast as possible. But what I heard from you is Arnie Gunderson's 3-step process. Step 1, test it. We need an independent lab that does this routinely, that can do a comprehensive test, not assuming that all the water is the same, to really understand what it is that we need to store. So step 1, test it. Step 2, engineer it. Get independent engineers to get this problem solved, that it is not the insurmountable, impossible mission that Holtec has tried to make us think it is, to store this water safely on site. And step 3, store it. So step 1, test it. 2, engineer it. 3, store it. And in all of those steps, take advantage of independent experts who do this every day and are not making money from our decommissioning trust fund by doing it quick and cheap. Is that, do I get an A+ for my lesson?
That was a great elevator speech. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Arnie, and thank you to the Stop Holtec Coalition for putting this event together. And thank you to all of you for coming, all of our elected officials. Thank you so much. And I hope to see everyone at the DOB meeting on December 6th, and to see your names next to mine on that petition, calling on Governor Hochul to store this on site and keep our air and our water free of this waste, and our health as good as possible. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Happy
you.
Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,
Thank you,
Courtney.
Ernie.
Thanks, Arnie. Bye.
You